I would say that the kind of hello world serverless setup is broken. We see a lot of organizations kind of starting to build on serverless. They take the most kind of simplest setup in the serverless framework. They deploy a hello world application, and then that's the state where they leave the development processes. And once you kind of start kind of building and kind of doing it on a daily basis, extending it to your team, it can really slow you down. And specifically, there's three things that we see that are happening. The feedback loop is slow. So, it's hard to develop locally, what Sven mentioned as well. Deployments are kind of slow. Environments can be kind of limited and kind of you can't, maybe you share one development stage in AWS that everyone is using. So there's a lot of hassle, a lot of kind of complexity, it seems at first. The other thing we see is that when you have a serverless project of any kind of size, it usually takes a bit more time to onboard new people than you might see on like, container-based server-centric applications, simply because the logic of the applications is usually distributed and you have to understand like tons of moving pieces at the same time, and that takes time. And also I would say like the tooling is new. It takes time to learn. And the third thing is when you're actively developing, debugging, no matter kind of what you're using, kind of in the local environment, understanding applications is tricky. Understanding what they are doing, how the requests are flowing. If something breaks, once you deploy something into a QA environment or a development environment, and that's a really kind of tricky thing to get right, then it always takes time. So I would say that the number one thing to do is to take some time off the initial enthusiasm and then invest in building the kind of the flow early on. Make sure the iteration speed is quick. Make sure you organize your resources quickly, or like the best way possible and the simplest way possible, and make sure you know how to debug and troubleshoot your application actually. So we'll go like quickly to go over those things in a bit more detail. Build a good local development environment. There's another slide about this. The other thing is know your AWS services. So there's actually tons of power and tons of kind of maturity built into the AWS offerings in, is it like, CloudWatch, X-Ray, Cloud9, the console itself, the SDKs. There's a lot of things you can do with it. I don't know the most of these, and or maybe I do by now, but it took me years to learn. I should have done it sooner, and I definitely kind of wasted time on this at some point, not knowing the ins and outs. Yeah, I think the other kind of thing is like what we struggled with early on, and what we see a lot of the customers struggle, is that when you're not organizing your resources, your AWS accounts the right way, a lot of customers only have one AWS account where everything is there, like the staging, the test, the QA, like tens of versions of the same serverless application, and then like hundreds of microservices. Really hard to understand, a lot of risk, complex CI/CD, a lot of security issues with that. Like the third thing, detecting problems. So once you deploy kind of a new version of your code into even a development environment or a staging environment, what we see is people using a lot of time roaming around in the console, in the UI, in CloudWatch, in X-Ray, not really understanding what's going on, spending a lot of time there. So you need to kind of find a way to effectively do that as well. I think the most important thing actually is speeding up the feedback loop. So when you're developing, when your team is developing an application or some new feature, How can you make it so that when somebody writes a line of code that they want to test, they get feedback the quickest? I think at my first time in my first company that I was working at, building on serverless, hours were wasted every day, just kind of waiting to test something in an AWS environment. That was in 2016, admittedly. So a lot of the tooling that exists now and the processes weren't available. But so there was basically three things that you can do. We did the first two. One of the things we did was, let's say you're developing a function, you run it locally, but all of the services that it's communicating are mapped to a cloud environment, so into your staging or development environment. So that's one thing we do. It's like super easy to kind of just write code, have a command line code or like command that executes it, and then you get the result straight away. You can change it in the next second, the code, and then try it again. The other thing was actually everything was local. So you could go onto a plane and develop serverless there, which was really tricky to set up. So emulating DynamoDB locally, for example, or whatever, that's super tricky. But if you're able to do it, it's quite good. I don't really recommend it, or like for some use cases, but not all. Because it might not be the same as actual AWS services. But if you're able to do it, much faster development times. And the latest kind of thing is that you can actually edit code live. So you can have your own everything set up in the cloud. You can use Cloud9 or Visual Studio or lots of other development environments or kind of code editors are doing this now. There's like the logging as well there, so you get the logs back. You can like do different types of things. So that's a good way to approach it as well. But it's super important to get the feedback loop up. I think two things that will save you: don't deploy after each code change the entire, like don't do like serverless framework deploy. That's really going to teach other developers not to do it as well. It's a major time sink. Even individual function deployments can sometimes take time. So try to avoid that. And the other thing is that really helped us was that at first, when you do a deploy, you basically, to see how it's working, you need to go to AWS and like dig in CloudWatch and in the UI and kind of figure out what's going on. That's a major time sink. There's ways to do that in the console. There's other tools for that. So try to avoid that as much as you can, but not always can you avoid it. There's another kind of slide about what slows down people in AWS or using AWS. I would say number one is not learning the ins and outs in dashboard. For example, whoever comes into the team, they need to go through the Cloud Guru course on like the basic AWS and kind of the more detailed courses as well. And they need to do an AWS Solutions Architect certificate. And that takes time in the beginning, but it really saves a lot of time in the future. If you know what you can do with CloudWatch, with X-Ray, with the console, they are really powerful, but they're super hard to use. So invest in that, it will save you time. Another part is we see a lot of customers overusing the UI or like the web console of AWS. It's very tricky to use quickly and efficiently. It's not meant for kind of day-to-day debugging at all. And there's better alternatives in the command line to kind of tail logs if you need to, or to look at metrics. There's different services that do it. If you stick in AWS, you have 15 developers in your organization, you're gonna lose days in a week. And I would say that the last thing that we've seen a lot and like kind of experience as well is that when you kind of don't invest time into when you kind of have weird setups in how you manage your resources, like not having separate AWS environments for like separate things, not having clean posture management, resources are configured all over the place, IAM policies are weird, complex CI/CD pipelines. So spend time kind of learning what are the right ways to do it, and kind of look at the different resources in AWS, talk to maybe solutions architects, or just like browse the community websites. There's tons of knowledge and materials about it in the web. So yeah, what we recommend, play around with tutorials and documentation a lot. That saves time later. Yeah, I think this is some of the things I already covered in the next slide by speaking. But yeah, you can use the console and third-party services, and yeah, invest time to operational excellence early on.